Sweet dreams are made of this. So I'm going to do something that I have not done in a very long time, and that is talk in specific detail about specific comic book property that I think not only should be made into a movie, but talk a little bit about how I should do that. Now, I say I haven't done that. It's come up a few times in roundtables in the last few months, but it's been a long time since I've just gone one-on-one with you folks talking about a specific idea, a property that I think should be made into a movie, and I actually don't even think it would be all that hard. So my pick for this time, and I don't know how many of these I'll do, but certainly on this go, I'm going to talk about Neil Gaiman's Sandman. This is one of my favorite comic books ever done, and definitely it's my second favorite concluded comic book of all time, in terms of just the scope of it, the tangents it takes, the headiness of it, the power of stories, which is a theme I love. This epic, sprawling tale from Neil Gaiman about the Lord of the Dream World is just an amazing piece of work. And it has been attempted to be adapted to film repeatedly, never getting further than scripting stages, even though they have had different directors attached at various points. Everyone's always dropped off. They can't seem to crack this. Now, before I get into this and start talking specifics, the first thing I'm going to openly acknowledge is if you were going to try and do the entire series and basically be all-inclusive about it, it would have to be a TV show. You couldn't do that as a film. And the reason for that is that if you haven't read Sandman, and I'll try and avoid too many huge spoilers if that's the case, but there will be some towards the end. I'll give you a warning though. So the thing about Sandman is it has your starting premise in terms of establishing who Orpheus, also known as Dream, is, what his deal is, and what it is that he has to do, some things that impact his life. But there's a ton of tangential material. There are some stories where he basically appears as a cameo at the very end, and it's about other people who simply are having their own thing going on that is somehow impacted by the dream realm, which is his realm. Or you have people just sharing stories in which he is a tiny part, because like I said, in many ways this is a story about the power of stories. So if you wanted to include everything, the only way to do that is a TV show, because a TV show, since you can section off things in an episode and just have it be that, you can do self-contained stories that don't impact a greater overall plot, and they can be a one-episode divergence, and then you come back to whatever else you're doing. But failing a TV adaptation, I do think it is still possible to make it work as a film, specifically to make it work as a trilogy of films. Now, everything I'm going to be talking about here is all story. I'm not talking casting. I'm not talking directors. I don't have a good head for that. I don't indulge in fan casting because I don't think I'm particularly creative in that area. I can never think of stuff that I think is really like, ooh, that'd be awesome. So I don't go there. So we are going to start talking about what we need to do to make this story work on film. And honestly, I think to start, it's really easy. You just start at the beginning. Preludes and nocturnes. And basically, you do the story straight, more or less. Fun thing about Sandman is that its first volume is the closest that it ever gets to a more traditional comic booky superhero narrative, and that's by design, because it's the way to ease the reader into this world before we get into the much more abstract, much more off the beaten path, much more unusual ideas, concepts, and characters that get involved later on down the line. So that first volume is a story that translates pretty much as is. So what it is you have Orpheus being taken out of his dream realm and captured by people who are actually trying to capture and control death, the entity of death, which happens to be her sister, his sister rather. Misgendering, my goodness, I should know better. So that happens, and then he's trapped by this magic for decades. And eventually he does break out, and there's a little bit of taking immediate revenge. But then he now has to find artifacts of his that also came with him when they summoned him and they took from him. And then he has to go and reclaim his realm, the realm of dreams, which has fallen into utter disarray in his absence. There are dreams and nightmares wandering around in places where they are not supposed to be, and the whole thing is just a mess. So it has an initial strong inciting incident, it has a quest narrative, and it has a final villain in terms of who he has to face down to get the last of the artifacts that he needs, which is his ruby. Now, I will have to get a little bit into spoilers of this, but I mean, honestly, if you haven't read Sandman, please just go read Sandman. So, what needs to change? Because there are a few things. The first volume of Sandman is basically the only one that had direct ties to the DC universe, because after that, it kind of went off and did its own pocket dimension kind of thing. Not like literally, it's not like they did a Crisis thing on it, but I mean, they didn't do ties anymore. So those have to go. So that means we need to ditch the Martian Manhunter thing that happens, which is a quick scene, not a big loss. We do have to lose John Constantine and his bit. He's a little bit more integral. And honestly, I'm a little bit sorry to see that happen, but I think the hassle that you're going to get from the hassle and confusion that you're going to get from people who are there then going to expect more ties between this and other DC properties in future films, which is absolutely not going to happen. I just don't think it's worth the trouble to have the character appear. So you can honestly, you don't even necessarily need him in that scene. You can still have Morpheus working alone, but you can have him doing any number of things to get everything pulled together. He can be dragging along Cain or Abel from his own realm for that little bit. You could have him dealing with basically any Constantine-esque sort of supernatural investigative character. You could introduce the character of Hob early and have it be him. So there are ways around that. The big one that needs to change, though, is the climactic battle and who he's facing down for that, because in the comics it is the character of Dr. Destiny, who's kind of a D-list DC villain. Now the thing is, this is not a case where we have to change it because then people will go, oh, so it's connected, like it will with Constantine, because I don't think anyone's scrambling for Dr. Destiny's inclusion in anything, and I think most people who aren't hardcore fans don't even know who that is. But he is still a supervillain. And his use in the story is still, oh, this was a supervillain. He was in Arkham, because there's that shout out too. And this was how he had his powers. He had, this ruby that was Morpheus's ruby. So his background is still too steeped in a world that has heroes and villains of that nature. So that doesn't work. So what you do instead is that you use a character who is already in these stories, is unique to these stories, is iconic as hell, and otherwise actually wouldn't be appearing in the stories that I've selected to be used across this series of films. You would have it be the Corinthian. The Corinthian is an escaped nightmare who fled to Earth and became a serial killer. He is freaky. You don't even have to really change anything beyond that. So you can roll with the idea that he, escaped the dream realm after Dream was captured. You can even have parallel tracks going on while Dream is gathering up, say, his sand and his helmet, that the Corinthian, who has already been just being a serial killer, the more generic type, is also pursuing the ruby, and he gets it first. So you can still do that very unsettling diner scene with the Corinthian instead of Dr. Destiny. If you don't want parallel quest tracks, you could have it that he already has it. And it may be harder to give the diner scene that way, because it's like, well, is he just doing it now? Is he always doing this kind of thing? Because he'll have had it for a while. But there are probably still ways to work around that so that you can still include it, or you can substitute in something else that will give equivalent unsettling feelings about this guy. So we get all that. We have basically the same climax, the same conclusion, with Dream ultimately reclaiming his realm. Now, I did say this was going to be a trilogy, but it is important to me that that is the entirety of the first film. You don't bother with a ton of setup for everything else. You tell that complete story, because it is a complete story. So that's where we start off. Then, if it goes well, we do a sequel. But what do? Now, there's 10 volumes of this thing, but the thing is, like I said, beyond just the issue of tangents and divergences, even the ones that focus on Morpheus himself, a lot of them don't have a narrative that lends itself to film. They're too loose, they're too meandering, they're too, well, dreamlike. They don't have a clear beginning, middle, end. They don't have a clear inciting incident, building tension, climax. There are a couple of stories that do, though, and my pick for the sequel, the next story to do, would be Seasons of Mist. That's volume 4. Now, in this one, you have a situation where Lucifer, the devil, decides he is going to retire from hell. He closes hell's gates, and he hands the key to hell over to Morpheus, basically saying, this is your burden now. You can do with this what you will. I'm out. Now, he's not necessarily expecting Morpheus to suddenly run hell, but by handing him the key, he knows he's handed him a world of trouble, because there's all kinds of factions that have a vested interest in what happens to hell after this. Basically, a whole bunch of deities just show up at Morpheus's door. So this includes things like the embodiment of order and chaos. This includes a group of demons who are native to hell who feel that they should have control of their own place. This includes Thor and angels from heaven being representatives of God, and all ththese people saying, you should give the key to us, and making a case as to why. So, and it also, Thor drags along Loki, which is fun. And these are the traditional Norse versions of these characters, not necessarily the Marvel versions, but it's still a lot of fun. So you have your inciting incident with hell getting closed down. You have building tensions as these various factions are brought into one place. Now, it's fairly isolated. It pretty much all takes place just at Dream's home as these people make their case, and the tensions build, and they pull various sort of tricks or manipulations to try and get what they want. It almost serves as a bit like a locked door mystery, and not in the sense that like there's a murder that has to be figured out, but you're just watching these machinations going on. But it also does have a climax, because ultimately Dream does face down one of the attendees for this little event, who basically starts to break his rules. And it's a fairly quick battle in the comics. You could make it a little bigger for the purposes of film. Not that hard to do. And the only potential issue on this is scope-wise. There's a ton of implications of this story, but it is, like I said, fairly isolated in terms of location. But, I mean, it's a dream realm. You can have it be shifting. You can have things change a bit more in accordance with Morpheus's whims, of course. But I think that you have enough freedom from that it does not have to feel like, man, this whole thing's just set in this one dude's mansion. It doesn't have to feel like that, even though it potentially could. So that is your second one. Now, there's something else we've got to do in this story. I would advise doing it as basically a pre-credit sequence, and it's unfortunately going to feel slightly detached, and it's the thing I avoided doing in the first film. But you need to do something that's going to set up the last one, because for the last one to pay off, it's going to take, frankly, way too much stuff. So we need to do something that's a little bit of cleanup from last film, as well as setting up for the next one. Now, I feel safe in doing that in the second film, because if the first film is successful enough that we're getting a sequel, it's a pretty good bet that we'll be able to milk at least one more after that. So it's a bit safer to lay in stuff that will pay off later down the line. And what that is we have to set up Daniel. If you've read the series, you know who that is. So Oh boy, how to explain this? Long story made as short as I can possibly do it. There was a woman who was pregnant and basically sort of living in the dream realm almost the entire time that Morpheus was trapped on Earth. And that basically stretched out her pregnancy, and it kind of impacted everything that was going on there. And she was being deceived by a couple of escaped nightmares. They weren't as bad as the Corinthian, but this is basically like loose ends that Morpheus has to tie up. He has to get his servants back, and he has to get her back into the real world, which is something that she doesn't thank him for, because in the dream world, her husband's still alive. In the real world, he is not. So we just you present it as Morpheus tying up loose ends to establish her child, which is Daniel, and the tension between the two of them, the anger between these characters. So that's what absolutely has to be set up here. There's one other piece that's going to have to be set up as well. It could be done at the tail end of Seasons of Mist, of this second film as well, to have things be a little bit cyclical in terms of parents and children and relationships. Depending on runtime, you may also have to bump it to a pre-credit sequence to the next film, but I think we could probably squeeze it in here because Seasons of Mist is one of the more straightforward ones, and it's one of the more straightforward ones that allows for trimming. You just cut down some of the various offers being made to Morpheus for the key to hell. So the other thing to tack in here is the story of Morpheus and Orpheus, which is his own son. Now, again, that's too long to do straight. You basically have to jump in at the end. So what I would advise is, if there are points across the middle part of the film, because you'll show the various guests trying to persuade Morpheus, but also talking amongst themselves, and some of them could be talking about Orpheus, talking about their host and this story about him and his son, and just sort of they're swapping stories, and this gets brought up and then pays off at the very end. Now, again, somewhat spoilers if you don't already know this stuff. Ultimately, Morpheus kills his son, and that's something that happens quite late, and after having basically left him to suffer for centuries, because Morpheus is very stubborn and can be very bitter and holds a grudge like you would not believe. But eventually he kills his son because it's what his son wants. His son wants just to die, and he grants him that by the end. So it's a confirmation that these stories that these characters were swapping about how heartless he is becomes past tense. Like, oh man, he really did just leave his son's alive head just to be lonely. But then he comes in and he allows him to die, and you realize, oh, he's changing. So that's your sort of, not post-credit sequence, but sort of epilogue bit in the second film. So that's going to get us to our third film, which is The Kindly Ones, Volume 9, if we're going by the original trades. So The Kindly Ones is basically, again, spoilers, the death of Morpheus. So we have a nice, full, complete trilogy here. Now, the stuff that I said we have to set up had to be set up because it impacts basically what is going on with this story. So we had to set up Daniel and his mother, because she through anger and fear directed at Morpheus, lashes out at him because she is afraid that he will take her son. And she reaches out to the Fates, also known as the Kindly Ones, and they say he is not mortal, he is not even a god, he is an endless, he is one of the eternal endless beings that must always be. We can't touch him unless he has spilled the blood of his own family. Guess what? He did that by giving his son peace at the end of the previous film. Dun, dun, dun. And so they then empower her to go after him. And there is a bit more to it than that as well, because part of what sets her off is Daniel gets kidnapped. She blames Morpheus. Who kidnaps him? Loki! So in the comics, it's actually Loki and Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a way to be able to set up Puck and get him into this story that is not going to eat up more time than it's worth. So I think you just have Loki acting alone rather than having him and Puck working together, as much as I did like that. So you've got Loki setting off this entire mess so that she will track down, go after her, and ultimately, yes, kill Morpheus. And that, more or less, is the film, as she is just coming after him and pulling things apart, and Morpheus is getting ready to face his own fate, which he does. And of course, I haven't talked about every character to be introduced along the way. His sister Death, yeah, she got introduced basically in kind of the epilogue at the very end of the first film. So she's been established, so we can have a nice touching moment with her when she comes for him. Maybe we can get the other Endless in there into Seasons of Mist, at least showing them, sort of having them established and everything else. But also, you know, this will be a big build climax. He's dead, and we also are gonna kind of roll in Volume 10 into this, which is The Wake, which is Daniel taking over and taking on the mantle of Dream. So we get that, so that it adds to the tragedy that for everything his mother went through to revenge for him, that she thought that is actually what causes her to lose him, because now he has something else. He has a mantle, he has responsibilities. He can't be with her anymore. And it's a note of finality for the character of Morpheus, while still establishing that stories keep going, even though they change. So yeah, I think there's actually, aside from, you know, a little bit of condensing, a little bit of trimming of a little fat, and a couple of character exercises like Puck, that story requires almost no change whatsoever. You just do it. And then you would have a trilogy of Sandman films that I think is incredibly doable. And what's really frustrating is, from what I read a couple of years back, there was at least one draft for a Sandman film that was more or less what I said that first one should be, specifically in terms of replacing Dr. Destiny with the Corinthians. So I'm not the only one thinking of these things. I'm not claiming these are the most original concepts in the world. Then no one else could have possibly thought of this. I don't have a magic bullet. I'm not that pompous, but come on! This, script-wise at the very least, should not be hard. Visually, yeah, this is going to be a lot of work. That's why I'm not going to even bother trying to think of direct. Okay, fine, I'll throw out one. Guillermo del Toro would be friggin' awesome. But, you know, that's not a requirement. There are other directors who could do it as well. If it actually had gotten made a decade ago, back when it was, last sort of cycle that they were working on it a while back, Terry Gilliam would have been great. So, you know, those kinds of directors are who should be placed on this. I know I said I wasn't going to talk directors, and that does not mean I'm suddenly going to talk cast, because I'm not. I absolutely am not. I think ideally you go with a chameleon character actor for Morpheus of some kind, because he is not meant to have the inherent charisma of a traditional leading man. You could find a leading man willing to do it, I suppose, but it's going to be tricky to not have whoever they are override, the character. Because, when I love Iron Man, but am I watching Tony Stark or am I watching Robert Downey Jr.? Now, I mean, at this point, he's been doing it long enough that I feel like it is a proper character, but, it's a balance. It's tough to work sometimes. But anyway, that'll do it. So those are my thoughts on how to adapt Neil Gaiman's Sandman to film, to a trilogy of films that I think would work quite well. What are your thoughts on what I've said? Do you think there is a better way to adapt this to film? Do you want to throw out some actual casting ideas? I know Joseph Gordon-Levitt was set for a while. He was actually set up as a director originally. That would have been interesting. But if you have any thoughts on any part of what I've just talked about, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all that stuff to do. If you want to support the show, even $1 a month, it really helps. There's a Patreon link. There's a link to Twitter. There's a link to my podcast. There's links for a mess of things all down in the description. So until next time, This council is adjourned.